For my action plan, I wanted to see how the impact of participation in whole group lessons, how that helps determine a student's score on the unit assessment during math and whole group reading. So I wanted to see if students, if they participated more, if that impacted their scores, or if they did not, how that further impacted their scores. That was the point of my action plan and what I was trying to see. My problem of practice was that students in classes, they don't always participate in group work when I'm doing whole group lessons, like in math especially, but reading too. And while this problem is not exclusive to minority groups or diverse learners, it does affect them. And then I was looking for ways to increase student participation, especially for those who are from diverse backgrounds and those that are kind of hesitant to share in the whole group setting. The purpose of this issue, it's specific to student learning and is important to me because I've noticed in my time student teaching that students who participate more, the ones that participate more, they tended to test better in both the math and the reading, and from my initial observations. So basically the students that wanted to share more and were engaged more during lessons, they were the ones that were getting the higher scores. So I wanted to see if I could find ways to get students who don't share as much to start sharing and to see if that would raise their test scores. That was my goal, to see if I could get them to participate more and they could raise their test scores. Some of the questions I used was, what strategies can increase participation for students from these backgrounds? What are types of questions that teachers like myself could ask to promote student thinking during a lesson? What types of strategies could teachers use to promote participation in whole group lessons? And then can strategies from other subjects that increase participation be used in math whole group lessons too? And for context, I'm in a third grade classroom, and there's about 23 students, depending on the day. When it's full, it's 23. Some students have not been there. There's students of various races and religious backgrounds. There's students at various learning levels, and there are some higher achievers and then some lower achievers. There are students with IEPs, 504s, and then trying to get those students to participate was a goal of mine in the action plan, especially with the ones with the IEPs and 504s. A few things that I found when I was reading is that teachers who build up student agency, they raise their chances that their students will achieve during a given lesson. And then not also by having a good classroom environment and not letting students marginalize their peers by talking about their responses or making them feel like they can't share. That's an important thing to do as well. And then I've worked on reinforcing the good ideas from students, kind of when they shared, kept them going on that by letting them know that it was a good question or it's a good answer, and we're going to build from that, and that it was valuable to the class. I wanted them to feel like they were a part of the environment as a whole. And then scaffolding helped me allow the students to take ownership of their work. It showed positive support I showed as much as I could throughout the day, and that helped me build on the learning environment. And then learning how to redirect a student's ideas when it's not right, that's one thing I worked on too, because I don't want one of these students to share that doesn't typically share, and then it be wrong, and then for them to get discouraged because it was wrong and they felt like it was wrong. That was something that I worked on. And then also it's important to know your students, because you shouldn't ask students the wrong questions that are out of their zone of learning. And a student's prior knowledge on a given topic can reflect their ability to want to share in the whole group setting. And then also creating or adding games that motivate students to share, that also worked too. So that's what myself and my teacher did. We added this game for sharing as a class, and also just behaving and acting the way they're supposed to. They could get tally marks and kind of gamifying the classroom, and it kind of helped them be motivated, and it kind of increased them to share too. That was one thing we worked on. And then a challenge that I had was that the literature talked about some higher achieving students who perform well in math and reading do not share too often. And that is true, as well as those who share a lot or want to share in the whole group setting, but do not receive the highest scores in their assessment. So you'll have students that don't share out loud, but when it's time to test, they still know what's going on. And then you have the students that really want to share and that do share, but just because they're sharing doesn't mean they know what they're doing on their assessment. So that was the challenge in this practice. And then some effective practices was making the learning meaningful to the students' work, using topics that related to them, including that class game that rewarded their participation or good behavior. That was an effective practice. And then finding something like that they can all get behind, brings them and makes them part of the environment and makes them work harder, is what I noticed. And there were some benefits. Students who shared a lot to begin with, they kept scoring high on their reading and their math assessments. And those who did not share as much, they initially started to share more, which is what I was looking for. And then as a result of that, their test scores did raise for the most part, which is good. And then I included a few strategies in this lesson, in this action plan. Like I mentioned, the game that myself and the teacher decided we would do. if they shared or if they were behaving and coming to class the right way, participating as a group the right way in that environment, then they would earn points. They would earn donuts, and then by the end, when they had enough points of days of behavior that was acceptable, then they would get a donut party. And doing this really helped them focus and build on the work, feel like they were members of the classroom environment, and that's one thing that I noticed. Over the course of these 3 weeks, I was able to use some of these strategies that I thought would increase participation. I asked them questions to get responses that I thought would be at their levels, at their correct levels, and I tried to make the learning seem culturally relevant to them. I tried to ask them questions that would make them feel like they're part of the lesson. And then I included that class game that I mentioned. The goal was to get them to share each day. And then over the course of 3 weeks, I was able to keep running tallies, which you'll see later in the slides, of how much they participated during the whole group setting in math and reading, and based on whether they raised their hand to share or if I called on them because I thought they could share, and whether they shared or not. That's one thing that I kept track of too. And then I let the class know, hey guys, I'm going to be keeping track of your responses over the next few weeks, so I encourage you to share in the whole group setting. If you think you can share, let's share. That was one thing that I did. And then I used their assessment scores in math from the previous cycles and compared it to their recent scores that were taking place during the timeline of the implementation. Because in the way we did at our school is that for the math, they go over, there's like 9 to 10 subject units, and they do 3 cycles. They go per cycle, 1 a week. So I was able to look at their old scores from the old cycles in the similar units, and then test that to compare that to what they were at now. For my data collection, like I mentioned, I collected a few different types of data. This allowed me to track if each student and their levels of participation contributed to their test scores. And then I also had to keep track of those who did not share initially, and I found ways to include them more. Sometimes that meant asking them to share when they did not raise their hands, though, as well. But, of course, I would not ask them to share something if I didn't think that they were successful. So this was something I found important, was knowing your students. And then once you know your students, then you can help them, and you can know when to ask them the right questions. That's what I found. And there were definitely themes I found in the data that showed me who likes to share and who doesn't. I was able to find this information out quickly, and then that let me focus on who did not share as much. And then I could spend my time finding ways to include them, because a good amount of these students just needed to be asked a question from time to time to keep them engaged in the lesson. That's one of the main things I found during this action plan, and then just throughout student teaching, was finding the right time to integrate the most students as possible into a lesson, and just to build on that environment to make them feel like they are a part of that classroom environment. That's what I was working for. And then a focus of mine now, I was mostly looking for students who shared an idea, an answer, or a strategy to solve a problem, both in reading and in math. And then whoever did those things, I gave credit to and marked that down. I looked at their assessment scores to compare to their older scores from previous in the year, to see how they did now versus when they were sharing more versus when they were not sharing. That was one thing I looked at. Like, here's a compilation. Here's a list, like the 3 lists that I used. I blacked out their last names so that for anonymity and to protect them. As you'll see, here's week 1 in the top left. The initial week 1 tallies were used to see who shared during the whole group reading and math lessons. I used these tallies to see if students that spoke out more, if they spoke out loud more to share with the class, if they did better or not on their assessments. Then over these 3 weeks, I wanted to wane down from, because those students who shared a lot, they typically did well on the unit assessments, and I had a feeling that not calling on them as much and trying to get others to share, it wouldn't impact their scores, and that is something that I found to be true. By not calling them and by trying to get others to share, the higher achieving students who did share a lot, they still got those high scores on their assessments. So they still did show that they knew what they were doing, which is what I thought would happen. And then some students did score higher during weeks they were participating in the lessons versus when they had lower verbal engagement earlier on in the year, like in week 1. So I did see an uptick in those who did share more, because they were called on and they were engaged more. That was one of my goals. So there were quite a few students who I called on them because I thought they could do something, and they were able to do it. And sometimes I look for students that were like, you could see they were like mouthing the words of the answer. You know, they do know it. They just have to build up that confidence. And I thought that by calling on them, that would give them that confidence. And they were right. And so I noticed that they did know the content too, like for the assessment. So and their assessment scores proved that. So that's one thing that I found from my analysis, my data. And again, with the findings, there were some major themes or patterns that I noticed among the students in the class. Those who shared or tended to share more in that whole group setting, they still did that, and they still got the high scores on their assessments too. And when I began to ask their peers who did not share as much, it didn't take away from the learning of those who usually shared and tested higher. Their test results proved that to be true. And then for those that started to share more by choice or by me calling them because I knew they could do something, their assessment scores also slightly went up too as a whole, as a class, which was something I was looking for. The class did see an uptick in performance on their assessments. And then these findings did help me address most of my initial inquiry questions. I found that sometimes you just need to call on students who are not raising their hands. But of course, you need to know these students and know what they know, so you can't put them in a position for them to fail. That's one thing that I learned. And then I found that I have to put in a lot of work early on in the year to understand my students and know them. And the more you know your student, just the better off you are in the classroom and to fostering that learning environment that's positive for everyone. And then this literature did say that scaffolding would benefit both the teachers and the students, and it did mention how important it was to know your students. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier, I've been talking about it, but just knowing your students is probably one of the things that I've learned to be true the most of anything in this whole action plan. Is just you got to know your students like it's the back, like they're like at the back of your hand. If you don't know your students, you don't know when to ask them the right types of questions, and then you're losing their engagement when you're not asking them the right questions that are in their zone of proximity. That's one thing that I learned. And these findings are so important to me in my teaching practice for many reasons. If I'm going to have a classroom of my own in the future, I need to know my students and prepare them with questions that affirm their beliefs and ideas, and I need to know who they are and what they know. That way I can know when to call on them, even if their hand's not raised. And the most important thing I learned from this whole action plan could end up being the significance of knowing the tendencies of the students in the class. I now believe that if you can know your students and their tendencies, the more students that you know, and the earlier you can find that out during the year, the greater number of students you can help throughout the year in your classroom. This project has definitely influenced my teaching approach in a few ways. I would say I have learned to not just call on the same students who want to share every day. That's probably something I did earlier on during student teaching, or even when I was subbing over the last few years, was you see a student raise their hand and you just immediately call on them. Instead of giving students time to talk amongst each other or give other students a chance to share. That's one thing that I learned, and I really feel like I focused on that during this action plan, and that's probably one of the most important things I learned during student teaching. And yeah, even though they're usually right, that doesn't mean their answers are benefiting the whole class. So to create the most inclusive learning environment for everyone in the class, you got to hear from as many students as possible, and that's getting a good amount of students to share each day in the whole group setting, and that's a goal of mine that I really try to perform now, and I'm going to be trying to do that throughout the next few years of teaching, and that's something that I really am focused on. And then again, not calling on these higher achieving students, it does not lower their assessment. They still know what's going on, their assessment scores, their data. That's what I learned. Then I learned that when students are motivated to reach a goal, like that class game we did with the participation and behavior, they worked harder as a group, and they were cohesive. They reminded each other, hey guys, we're working towards this. Hey, we're doing this. We want this donut party. Let's work together. Let's listen. Let's share at the right times. There are times throughout the day where students they'll tell each other, hey guys, we need to do this. We need to behave the right way so we can win this. Okay, and that's so finding a way to motivate your students is something that I learned from this action plan. And then in the future, of course, I'm not just going to call on the same students every day. That is something that I probably did in the beginning of my student teaching, like I mentioned, but I have not been doing that as much. And it's better to have the entire class share, feel like they can contribute. And then I'm going to keep looking for ways to have my lower achieving students share in the whole group setting. That's something that I'm going to keep working on in the future. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this action plan. I had a good time enacting it. I thought it was fun, and I learned a lot. Thank you for watching. Here are my references. And again, thanks for watching.